talk now. Tanvi is the student coordinator today. Tanvi, would you like to start?
Okay.
Am I audible?
Yeah, you are.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tanvi Sharma, and I'm from Department of History, Lady Shri Ram College for Women. And today, I welcome you all to a to a lecture by a very special guest, Sohail Hashmi sir, on the topic Heritage Made to Disappear. Made to disappear. So, is a filmmaker and a writer. He is also a history enthusiast and conducts heritage walks around Delhi. He has worked with PTI TV, National Literacy Mission, Home TV, BITV, Kingfisher.com. He makes documentaries and writes on social issues related to culture, language, education, and communalism. He has conceptualized, researched, scripted, and produced documentaries on women's education, lesser known freedom fighters, and marginalized women. उर्दू है जिसका नाम a 100-minute documentary on the history of Urdu, directed by Subhash Kapoor, that Suhail sir conceptualized, researched, and scripted, was produced for Ministry of External Affairs in 2003. Sir has also produced documentary on the Department of Biotechnology and a film for Kashmir tourism about the journey from Srinagar to Tutuk, the last Indian village in Ladakh. Sohail sir is a founding trustee of Safdar Hashmi Memorial Trust, that is Ahmed. Um, um, he uh, he enjoys travel, photography, food, cooking, and loves to talk about them all. He also writes about Delhi, its language, its food, its water bodies, and its monuments. After the talk is over, the floor will be open for the questions. If you wish, you can also type the questions in the chat box. Now, without any further delay, I would pass the mic to the sir, and I would also request you all to please switch off your mic, and if possible, please switch on your camera.
So you want me to begin now?
Yeah.
Yes, sir, please.
Yeah.
Sir.
Okay. Am I audible?
Yes, you
Is
are.
my voice clear? Is it? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay. So the topic I had I must reiterate what I had said earlier, that I am really grateful to the Department of History, LSR, the History Society, and the LSR Students Union, who have, and forgive me if I've missed out somebody, for having given me the opportunity to talk today to about this question of heritage. And I have deliberately chosen the topic made to disappear. Now, before I get into the meat of what I'm going to say, let me preface it by saying that heritage is not something fixed in time and space. And as we move from the present into the future, then our what is our present today becomes a part of our heritage. And what we had inherited as heritage, some of that the succeeding generations might give up. So it is not something that is static, fixed in time. The notion that is being pushed these days, that the only valid heritage for this country are things that happened 5,000 years ago. Nobody really knows what happened So we have constructed an imagined heritage, and large part of that heritage is mythology. And the problem that and this I think is a problem that is uh, unique to us, to South Asia specifically. Because if you go to Rome, there is a place in Rome where you have this large figure of a she-wolf suckling two human offsprings. And the story is that these are the two brothers who established the city of Rome. They were abandoned, and the she-wolf suckled them, and they grew up and they became great empire builders, and they are the founders of the city of Rome. It's a very interesting story, but it is very difficult to believe, because wolves will make short shrift of human infants instead of suckling them. Nobody in Rome actually believed that Rome was built by two brothers who were suckled by a she-wolf. But there are all kinds of stories that we believe. And now there is insistence that this is our heritage. As you study history, as you develop sense of inquisitiveness, and you develop a sense of approaching things from a scientific standpoint, you gradually begin to shift the grain from the chaff. And this is not history. But unfortunately, for an overwhelming majority of this country's population, and let's not forget that more than 40% of them, despite whatever the government figures might claim, despite all the printed reports, more than 40% of them even today cannot read. So their source of information is only what they hear or what they see on the idiot box. And the idiot box is reinforcing all these. So there is an idea of heritage that has been created, and this heritage is static. It does not change. It has been like this for last 5,000 years, and for the next 50,000 years, it's not going to change, because it is mythology. But if you're looking at heritage, which is a creation of human society, human individuals, there are things that were part of our past. All of that is not our heritage. Or at least it is past, it's a part of our past, but it is not our heritage. Caste discrimination is not our heritage. It's a burden that we carry on our shoulders, and the faster, the sooner we get rid of it, the better. Not giving women equal space in society, something that we have inherited from the past, but that is not a heritage that I am proud of. When Khap Panchayats after Khap Panchayats get together and they say girls will not wear jeans and they will not be allowed to use the cell phone, this is not our heritage. And all of them are talking of our heritage. ये हमारी परंपरा में शामिल नहीं है. Giving equal rights to women is not our parampara. This is not our heritage. This is a heritage that we have to build. And when I began by saying that we are constantly, if we are advancing, developing, progressive society, we keep on rejecting dead, rotten values from our inheritance, and we take what is living, what is of value, and that we call our heritage. So I think this is, I wanted to preface what I'm going to say now with this, with these few introductory remarks. Now, normally we look at heritage as built structures. When you talk of heritage, people only talk of built structures. Though there is much more in our heritage which is not built, which can't be touched, seen. The way we speak, the way we sit down, the way we eat, our music, our languages, our attire, all this is also heritage. And structures built with stone, they remain as they are, or they break down under either through human intervention or through agents of weather, and they collapse. But as long as they are standing, they, you can make out, ये अकबर के पीरियड का है, ये शाहजहां के पीरियड का है, ये अशोका के पीरियड का है. But in everything else, the intangible part of our heritage is in a state of constant flux. The clothes we wear, the music we listen to, the food we eat, it is always constantly changing. That is also our heritage. And this idea that we are a society that represents both continuity and change, and all societies, all living societies represent that. That is how you become a society. You inherit from the past, you reject something, and you adapt new. Before Lala Sri Ram, who went to school with my grandfather, before he started the schools that he started, and then Lily Shri Ram set up, and these schools, colleges were set up in her name. You couldn't find girls from Delhi going to school. The first school that opened in Delhi where girls could go to study was the Indraprasth Kanya Mahavidyalaya, opened in 1904, and it was started by Annie Besant. The Theosophists started it. Before that, there was not a single school for girls in the city. So, these are issues connected with heritage. These are issues connected with inheritance, with the values that we have taken, and we have to, as historians, look at them with a very critical eye. So this is one aspect of heritage. I'm not going to be dilating too much on that, because these are things that you can see all around yourself, and you can see how they are changing and the dynamics. And you can also see who are the people who are opposed to these changes. To girls wearing skirts, to not wearing the ghungat, not changing their name after getting married. All these things. There is a strong body that resists this. Who are these people? You have to identify and decide what you're going to, how you're going to resist this system of values. But I'm going to be talking more specifically now on the concrete. on the structures. In 1920s, when New Delhi had started, construction had started, and the British, who had shifted the capital from Calcutta to Delhi, they were also planning out what would happen when the city begins to expand. And all of you must have heard about the 7 cities of Delhi. So they were not cities, they were just 2 cities. The other 5 were mere capitals. They became capitals, and then the next king made another capital. But there were these hundreds of structures, thousands actually. So they engaged a gentleman called Zafar Hasan, who was a staffer of the Archaeological Survey of India, knew Persian, knew Arabic, and he was a scholarly person. And they, Maulvi Zafar Hasan, and they said, prepare for us a list of the structures in Delhi. This 3-volume list with comments of Zafar Hasan about the architectural importance, archaeological importance, or the lack of it, of each monument, each structure is there. It's a 3-volume publication. Aryan Books have republished it recently. Runs into, I think, about 1,500 pages or so. And this list consisted of 3,000 entries. So in 1920, there were 3,000 structures listed by the Archaeological Survey of India. In 2010, 90 years later, on the eve of the Commonwealth Games, the Archaeological Survey of India revisited that list. They could not find 1,000 of the structures. All they could put together was 2,000. So in 90 years, 1,000 structures have disappeared. Now when I say made to disappear, this is what I am talking about. There are 3 kind of things that have happened to these 1,000 structures. One that is obvious, all of you would have mentioned it if I had asked you, is encroachment. And if any one of you live in Kailash colony, which is not too far away, not in Kailash colony, but in Kailash, across the road from LSR, there is this village called Zamurrudpur, and from there is an entry into GK1. If you take that entry, you will be driving down a road or walking down a road that passes through the GK1 Residents Club, Residents Association. That club has been under litigation for years. And on your, this will be on your right, on your left is a large park. And in that park, there are 3 medieval domes. They are unmistakably Sultanate period. And at least 2 of them, because their walls lean away from you. They begin here, and then, if you keep on extending them, they will become like pyramids. From all 4 sides, the walls lean away from you. This is a trademark of Tughlaq architecture, but it was copied also by the Lodhis. So, of the 3 of these structures, at least 2 belong to the Sultanate period. They could be late Tughlaq or early Lodhi. One of them is now an Arya Samaj temple, and the other is a Vaishnav temple. The third, I think, was being used either as a Hanuman temple, which is an extension of the Vaishnav cult, or as a Shiva temple. And they have horrible steel gates have been put, and there are all kinds of calligraphy and all that, Om and swastiks and all that has been done. These are medieval mausoleums that have been encroached and repurposed. On Africa Avenue, I have seen one structure gradually being transformed beginning from 1981. Now it is the international headquarters of the Vishwavyapi Ram Rajya something Sanstha. So this is an organization with the laudable objective of establishing Ram Rajya all over the world. They haven't the resources of building an office for themselves, so they have captured a medieval mausoleum and repurposed it. So this if you can, I've been planning to do a walk only of these structures that have been repurposed in Delhi. It's going to be a very long walk, spread through large parts of Delhi. So this is something that is happening regularly. One of the most remarkable of these that is happening right now is the famous Khidki Masjid. And the Khidki Masjid is opposite the Saket Mall. Now, it had a retaining wall. That wall was broken. But let me go back a little earlier. Let me go back to the time of partition. When India became independent, there was a large number of people who came from what is now Pakistan. And there were people who had lost everything. They didn't have houses to live in. Members of their family had been killed, and worst had happened. There were those who had gone from these parts and into what is now Pakistan, and they had faced the same. What happened to them? I don't know whether anybody is documenting that in Pakistan. What happened to those who came from there? Some documentation has happened, but it has its own problems. In the documentation, we don't talk about the Dalits who came from there. We don't talk about, for example, there is very little material in Delhi available on the Bengalis who came and settled in Delhi. We only talk of the great sufferings of the migrants from Punjab. And the migrants did not come only from Punjab, they also came from Multan, and they came from Sindh, and they came from that of Gujarat, which is desert and is in now Pakistan. We don't talk about them, we only talk about the Punjabi. So, I'm giving you these details to underscore how we look at our immediate past is also constantly being colored in the way it is being documented, in the way it is being written. So around that time, there were these large number of homeless people who had no shelter, no place to hide. And this is the monsoons. The wise people who decided to cut up this country in two also chose the worst possible weather to do it. Middle of the monsoons. So there was this mosque in the Khidki village. Khidki village had quite a large number of Muslim population, and these Muslims were Mewati Muslims. And the Mewati Muslims had converted, they were local Jats who had converted into Islam in Firoz Shah Tughlaq's time. So there has been a presence of the Mewati Muslims around Delhi from the 13th century. Many of them were living here and they were working, they had small holdings and they were peasants and they were tenants of the Jat landlords in this area. When the killings and rioting began, many of these people escaped to Mewat and the mosque was deserted. When this wave upon wave of migrants came, Sardar Patel sent a large contingent, he was the Home Minister, to settle down in this mosque. And this is the story that I was told by Master Ji. Master Ji, I haven't met him for last 3 or 4 years. He wasn't too well and he was getting on in years. He was born in this village. There was only a primary school here. He studied till class 5 here. And the middle school was located in Mehrauli. So he used to walk every day from here to Mehrauli. And he did his class 8 from here. And in those days, if you had done class 8, you could be appointed a school teacher. So he then began teaching in the school where he had studied. And he told me this story. He said when these Charnathis were brought in and they were made to settle down in the mosque, so the city elders, the village elders, and there was not a single Muslim among them. They were Jats and Brahmins. And Master Ji, who was much younger than all of them, but because he was the school teacher, he was asked to accompany the delegation. And they went and met. One guess, who do you think they met? Anyone? They went and met Pandit Nehru. You could actually walk into Pandit Nehru's house. And they walked in there and they said, this is wrong. This is a very old masjid and you cannot have people living in it. Pandit Nehru asked his education minister, Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, to go and make inquiries. So Maulana Abul Kalam Azad came and the village elders and Master Ji took him inside the mosque, showed him around, told him this is a very old mosque and now because the Muslims have run away, the mosque is abandoned, but that does not mean that they will not come back and that does not mean that you can use it for housing. So Maulana Abul Kalam Azad went back and reported to Pandit Nehru, who must have then instructed Sardar Patel to ask these people to move out. So they were moved out and they were told that you can build your houses outside. So within a distance of 20 yards or less, on 3 sides, these people built their huts, which are now multi-storied flats. The law has meanwhile changed. The law is that you cannot build within 100 meters of a protected area. But these people have been living there from 1947, when this law did not exist. Now the 4th generation is growing up, and young boys and girls are going to get married, and the boy who gets married is going to bring his newly wedded wife, and they will need a separate unit, at least a separate room. And those people who live in these houses cannot add a single room because it is not permitted. but that hasn't stopped them. Next time you happen to go there, go into the Khidki Masjid and see brand new construction on all three sides. The fourth side opened in front of the road. And suddenly the mall started coming. And people realized this place is to now have this village, this part of the village which faces the mall. There's going to be great pressure on the land. Overnight, a temple started coming up. ASI went to the court thrice. The ASI got orders in its favor. The Delhi High Court issued orders that this construction must be stopped. Nothing has happened. Now there is a full-fledged temple there with a signboard saying Prachin something temple, with an underline text saying आप CCTV कैमरे की निगरानी में हैं. And once this is become a fait accompli, now comes the hammer blow. This is not a mosque. ये महाराणा प्रताप का किला है. Every day, people are being taken there, and there are self-appointed guides who tell you that this is Maharana Pratap's fort. So, this is how you are constantly. So you are encroaching, you are repurposing, and you are redefining. These are, to my mind, three major methods through which built heritage is being made to disappear. Because it will be historians who will write about it. Increasingly, you will not have too many institutions teaching histories. They are already talking of changing the history textbooks. So if this continues, you will actually have no heritage left. You will only have an imagined heritage left. I'll give you one more example before I close this. You must have heard of the famous Bawli of Agrasen. I don't know how many of you know that there was no king called Agrasen. You are students of history, correct me if I am wrong. There is a Maharaja Agrasen mentioned in the Mahabharata. But we are talking history, we are not talking mythology. When did Agrasen rule? Where did he rule? The Bawli of Agrasen, popularly known as Agrasen ki Bawli, it had a ASI stone tablet erected outside which said, popularly known as Agrasen ki Bawli. This is, however, a Sultanate period structure. Now, however means what? This is not Agrasen ki Bawli. This is the dual period structure. Whoever wrote that text was protecting his back, but he wrote this. In 2009, there is an international Agarwal Samaj that entered into an MOU with the Archaeological Survey of India. And they said they built by the ancestor. Maharaja Agrsena. That is how he is being portrayed. So therefore, we will look after this bounty. The ASI immediately signed it and gave it to them. Now, if you were to go to Google and led to a page which is called the only site for Agarwals run by Agarwals. And the story that you will read about Maharaja Agrasen is Maharaja Agrasen was a Pratapi king. He was in love with a young princess. Bhagwan Indra was also in love with the same princess. Second tense, history goes out of the window. Maharaja Indra was extremely angry. He caused a drought to happen on the territory that Maharaja Agrasen ruled. Enter the Brahmin priest who says, Maharaj, you have to dig a well. When you reach water, it will rain. So Maharaj picked up a shovel and started digging, and the moment he hit water, the rains came. Bhagwan Indra took pity on the mortal and pardoned him. So Agrasen and his beloved lived happily ever after. 13,000 years later, the descendants of Maharaja Agrasen built this bounty. This is the story. The oldest human civilization that we know of is 6,000 years old. These guys have a family tree that runs across 13,000 years. Were humans actually living as families 13,000 years ago? Did we have kings? Horses were domesticated 10,000 years ago. But this is what is going to be made into history. Increasingly, it is being made into history. So, if we are not on our guard, you will have no heritage to talk about. You will only have these imagined fancy tales of a past that never existed. Thank you very much. If there are any questions.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the wonderful talk.
Thank you so much, sir, for the insightful lecture. This actually enlightened us all with very new information that we would haven't found anywhere. Thank you so much, and we hope that we have the honor to have you with us in the future as well. Now I would like to open the floor for the questions. If anybody has any questions, please unmute yourself.
I had some note popping up. Vyomika, I think, had a question.
All right.
And Jyoti Gemini also has a question.
So please unmute yourselves and ask questions.
I think we can start with Vyomika. Vyomika, please unmute yourself.
Good evening, sir. Thank you for that talk. That was really an amazing talk. I actually had two questions. Number one, on if, as you say, heritage is always shaped by the people in power and they end up choosing what we discard and how we portray narratives, how do we counter like this majoritarian narrative? And secondly is a more specific question on the Horse Khas Fort. So like a lot of people constantly keep saying that it's a fort, but when you go into the history, it has actually, when you read about it, it was actually a madrasa. So I wanted some clarity on that because I've been like revisiting that place over and over, and I wanted to know more about just the place and what it actually was, and how should one like accurately refer to it.
Okay. No, I did not say that people in power define are creating heritage. Did I say that?
No, sir. I mean, by all the examples that you talked about, that ends up being the implication. Like, no matter how much, like, for example, the masjid having a temple constructed around it, the three domes being converted to temples, it seems like people in power end up controlling these narratives. And it seems like us as students or as historians cannot even do much to counter it because majority people will end up following these narratives. So what do we do? Like, how can we contribute?
Well, I think that since we are not in power, and by we I mean all those people who don't agree with this narrative. So, but we have access to the written word. We have access to texts. As conscious individuals, what we can do is to make as many people understand this, and through whatever means at our disposal to spread the word and make people understand that what you are being told is not actually true. For example, this whole, you'll have to give me a minute, there's somebody at the door. Just give me a minute. Acha, sorry. So, if you make people sit down and tell them that, this is the story that you are that is being told about Agrasena. This is what is there on their site. And then you tell them, 13,000 years ago. What are you talking about? One needs to reason it out. Because this is not something that you can convince people in a shouting match. You have people who are not prepared to listen. But there is a very large segment of this country's population with whom you can actually sit down and talk. And we need to do this in whatever way we can do this to make them understand. As students of history especially, this I would think would be our responsibility. The kind of work that the historians of our earlier generations have done, there is that kind of work needs to be done continuously. But using that material to make it more accessible. So everybody has heard these stories of how bravely Aurangzeb ran away from the Agra fort. I've taken students of the National School of Drama there. And so one of them about this question. I said, all of you know the story. But have you asked one question? What was Aurangzeb doing in the Agra fort? Why did he go there? He was arrested from the court. He was attending the court. What was he doing in Agra? He was actually negotiating with Aurangzeb. He wanted to be given the mansabdari of 7,000 horses. And Aurangzeb was telling him, sorry, the command of 7,000 horses can only be given to members of the royal family. Had these negotiations reached a culmination, this whole Aurangzeb, Shivaji myth that has been created wouldn't have happened. So all this material is available. What we need to do is to to my mind, especially young historians. Now, I will never expect senior historians who have spent their life studying all this and they have unraveled all this thing to us, and they have pointed to us how history has been colored by the colonialists and the followers of the Anglo-Saxon school of history writing. But now, since this has been unraveled, we need to make this as popularly accessible as possible. Because on the other side, it is only myths that are being made accessible. I was trekking in Kashmir once, and above Sonmarg, we came across a lake. It was very, very cold, and there was a lake, and we were just, 5, 6 of us. We are looking at that beautiful lake in the middle of so much snow all around, and a local fellow arrived here, self-appointed guide. And he said, this is Draupadi Kund. So we said, why? How come Draupadi Kund? So this is the Pandavas were here on their Vanvas. And they said, and around the lake there were 5 rocks. And they said, these are the Pandavas. This fellow said, these are the Pandavas. So we said, what is the story? So he said, they, on their Vanvas, they came here. And there was this beautiful lake. And Draupadi wanted to take a bath. So she told the Pandavas, I am going to take a bath. And all of you stand around, face away from me, don't turn back. Don't look at me. So they said, all right. Then she disrobed and entered the lake to take a bath. And the Pandavas could not resist the temptation of looking at the naked body of their wife. They must have seen, but not in this story. They turned back to look at her naked form, and they turned to stone. And the 5 rocks are the Pandavas. So I asked this narrator, but after the Vanvas got over, they went back and he said, I don't know about that. These are the Pandavas. So you have any place you find 5 rocks, 5 caves, 5 boulders, and you have a Pandav story. Now, this you need to point out to people, this can't be true. Human beings don't turn into stone. But this needs to be done. Because I don't think there is any other way. Now, come on, you're not going to go and argue with a gentleman who tells you that we had plastic surgery and that's how Ganesh was created. And we had, what is that called? Something cell therapy through which Karn was born out of the ear of Gandhari. So you can't go and argue with these people, but there are very large number of people who have been fed this mumbo jumbo. They are in your neighborhood, they are your next door neighbors, they are kids in school who you meet socially. It might make you a little unpopular, but there would be others who would listen to you. So, but I think that is the only way. That is the only democratic way. I don't know of any other. Yeah? I don't know whether that answers your question. The other question was about horse khas. The horse khas was originally just a water tank. And when Alauddin Khilji created his garrison town, Siri, where he kept the bulk of his army at one place, the army sucks up resources like nobody's business. 35% of our national budget is spent on our armed forces. That is the kind of resources that an army needs. This army with horses and camels and elephants also required huge quantities of water. So Alauddin Khilji diverted a couple of streams in a depression and created a huge water tank, which was originally known as Hauz-e-Alai, built by Alauddin Khilji. Like Alai Darwaza, the gate that he built, and so it was Hauz-e-Alai. And later, in the time of the Tughlaqs, Muhammad bin Tughlaq carried out repairs of this. This is the time when Ibn Battuta travels to India, and he records it as a construction of Muhammad bin Tughlaq, though it is actually built by Alauddin Khilji. Later, Firoz Tughlaq builds a madrasa here. There was no fort. There was a madrasa here, and Firoz Tughlaq comes to the throne in 1351. And he rules till 1380 something. And this is the time when the Mongols are running amok in Central Asia. And all the major seminaries and libraries of Central Asia, in Samarkand, in Bukhara, in Baghdad, the Mongols have destroyed. This is the time when this madrasa comes up. And this was known as Madrasa Firoz Shahi. And that short period of about 3 to 4 decades, this became the most important seminary in all over the world. So scholars from all over, from Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, from Farghana, from Iran, from Mashhad, from Morocco, which was Marrakesh, from and all these places where there were tradition of Muslim scholarship and madrasas which had been attacked by the Mongols, these people started coming here. But by the time of the gentleman, the ancestor of Babur, Timur, the Mongols had also converted to Islam. And then gradually those madrasas came up again, and Madrasa Firoz Shahi gradually lost in its importance. And then with the collapse of the Tughlaq dynasty and the sacking of Delhi by Timur, all that collapsed. But this was essentially a madrasa and one of the most important madrasas of its time.
Thank you so much, sir.
Yeah.
So we have the second question from Jyoti Gemini. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask the question?
Yes. Good evening, sir.
Good
It
evening.
was an amazing session. I am really obliged to listen such a session. It was really very insightful. So my question to you is that you mentioned that the heritage now is in imagined way or in ideal form. So what exactly is our heritage now? As you also mentioned that till 50,000 years it won't be changed, but like generations and generations are coming up. And after almost 50,000 years after today, there must be some change in the heritage, but you mentioned it will be same. This is my first question.
Sorry, I'm sorry if I've created this confusion. I believe, this is what I began by saying, that heritage is not static in time. What we take as our heritage is constantly informed by where we are with reference to that heritage. There are bits that become irrelevant for us, that bits that we no longer uphold, and I gave you some examples. the way Manu wanted to structure society. That is our past, but that cannot be our heritage. The position in which Manu wanted an overwhelming majority of this country's population to stay is something that was a reality in our past. Some of that continues to be our reality. The way we, even today, Dalits are being lynched. But that cannot be our heritage. These are bits of the rotten, separating past that need to be cut away and thrown off. The past, that is the imagined past that is sought to be created. It is that past which is unchanging. And those who are creating that imaginary heritage, if they have their way, it will not change for the next 50,000 years. So there are two schools of thought contending each other right now and through all times in history. There are those that want change and progress, and there are those that benefit from moribund values. This is the clash now. This has been a clash for a very long time, and it will exist as long as human beings survive. It is always the minority that wants change. The majority is against change. And this you need to remember. Change is always brought by a minuscule minority. When Galileo said that it is not the world, the center of the world is not the earth. And actually, we revolve around Galileo and before that Copernicus. When they propounded that, they were in a minority of one against the entire Roman Catholic Church, and Roman Catholic Church controlled all knowledge. But who won? This is the might of reason. If we are confident that we have taken a scientifically correct position, we are not afraid of change. Actually, there is this scientist who's also a poet and filmmaker, happens to be my brother-in-law, who said it is only science that celebrates failure. Every new scientific discovery rewrites earlier discoveries, and it becomes an occasion of celebration because you have expanded the boundaries of knowledge. It is only religion that believes in fixed culture, fixed ideas, unchanging reality. So that is the struggle. And that is the struggle between ignorance and knowledge. If you have chosen the path of investigating into the past, then there are no holy grails. Everything needs to be questioned. Everything. And unless your own sense of what is right, informed by all that you have gained through your exposure to literature, to historical research, to investigation, to archaeology, and now there is genetic science that is making major contributions into our understanding of the spread of human civilization. All that is on our side. And blind faith on the other. It's not an easy fight, but this is the fight that we are going to win. Blind faith can never succeed, eventually. Yeah?
I hope that answers your question, Jyoti. And
Yeah, I have one more question.
Yeah,
Can I
sure.
go ahead?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Sir, you mentioned that the inquisitiveness that is approaching from the scientific point of view is same as we take out grain from the shaft. So similarly, that point of view is taken out from the history. So the point out that is taken, is it still history or it is not? And if it is, then how is it a history?
You see, I'll tell you, quite a lot of these things are, take for example, you must have heard this phrase, हाथ की पांचों उंगलियां बराबर नहीं होती. You heard that? All of you must have. Now this is a physical fact. All 5 fingers have different lengths, and this fellow is even positioned differently at a 90-degree angle from the rest of the. But if you apply this to society and say the unequalness is a divine creation, then you are distorting a fact that you have gained from observing of the human hand, and you are applying it to human society, and therefore justifying the thumb that will rule and everybody else who is subservient, and within that there are people with different powers. So at every stage in evolution, you will, from your past, you will pick up things and you will discard, and you will pick up things and you will hold them dear. What you hold dear, you hold them dear because they are relevant for your life today, and they will help you and the society to advance. Everything that retards progress of human society, that prevents equal opportunities, that prevents democratic spaces for everybody, cannot be. It is our past, it is our history, but it is not our heritage. It is not something that we should carry with us. We will obviously, as students of history, we will always have to study that, understand that, because once you know this is where you came from, you can also see what is the journey you have made from that situation. You see, there was a time when, for the sin of allowing sounds of Sanskrit shlokas to enter his ears, a Shudra would get lead poured into his ears. Now that it happened in our past, but that is not our heritage. That is the distinction I'm making. And what is our heritage, what is not our heritage, that should not be glorified. How can you glorify Sati in this day and age, and glorify marrying of 5-year-old, 6-year-old girls, and make a major issue in Rajasthan and Gujarat, and it keeps on happening all over. And there are people who defend it as our parampara. There are Sati temples in this. Or take a more contemporary. how can well-educated girls who are working, who do a 10 to 5 job, or at time they are working from home and they're looking after kids and kids' education, all that. And one day a year they fast for the long life of their husband. The idea itself. And some people say, no, we also fast for the long life of our wife. This is tokenism. Why should a woman be expected to fast for the long life of her husband? And in many cases, these husbands are drunken idiots who don't do anything, who don't share any household work, who have no contribution to the children's education. The women do it single-handedly, and they are also holding down a job and fighting a glass ceiling. But at home, they have to come and fast for Pati Parmeshwar. So now this is what it is. It is not only in the field of academics. It is there in our lives every day. What we accept as heritage, quite a lot of that is very, very regressive. Very regressive and very oppressive, especially for women. So that is what I am trying to underscore. I hope that in some way answers your question.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
So the third question is by Anna Sharma. Are you present in this meeting? Okay, so we'll take the next question. It is by Mritrika Maitra. Can development goals and preservation of material heritage coexist?
Can material growth?
Sorry, I'll repeat the question. Can development goals and preservation of material heritage coexist?
Well, if we have only material development and we have no heritage, then we are not a society that I would love to be part of. If at any point of time we think that development goals, that heritage has become an obstruction in the path of development goals, I would say reorient your development. They cannot happen at the cost of your heritage. There is actually no clash, but I'll tell you how it is presented. There was a plan to make Shahjahanabad and what is wrongly called Lutyens Delhi, but New Delhi and Shahjahanabad, the contiguous area, into a World Heritage City. This proposal was the first proposal to be moved from India to UNESCO for Delhi being declared a World Heritage City. Till then, we did not have a World Heritage City. Tangentially, I was also involved in some way in a couple of seminars that were held around the theme when the project was being prepared and all that. Now, this proposal went through several years. It went through several presentations. UNESCO asked questions. Some of the area had to be relocated. Originally, Tughlaqabad was also part, but they said it has to be a contiguous area. So, areas were whittled down, and eventually we zeroed in on Shahjahanabad and that part of New Delhi, which is the capital, where all the government headquarters and government offices, Rashtrapati Bhavan and all that. It was in its final stages when UPA 2 government fell. Modi government 1 came to power. That is when this questionnaire, last set of questions came. Answer these questions, and then in the next session of the World Heritage Committee, Delhi will be given the status. Our Ministry of Urban Development or whatever, they said we are withdrawing the proposal. After 6 years of painstaking work by architects, city planners, all kinds of people, academics, we withdrew the proposal. And the argument was put forth that if Delhi is declared a heritage city, then all development will come to a halt. The fact of the matter is that if the entire area of New Delhi, of the capital city of Delhi, was taken as 100, then the area that would have been affected by declaring a part of Delhi as a heritage city would be less than 4% of the total area. You had 96% of the area of Delhi open for development, whatever development you wanted to do. And that is the strength of the builder lobby. It is the builder lobby and also the politics. Why should the city of Shah Jahan become a heritage city? So they killed it. Now, I have been to this heritage city in Uzbekistan. कौशल क्या नाम था उस शहर का? उज्बेकिस्तान का हेरिटेज सिटी? Khiva. Yeah. The city is Khiva. The entire city is a heritage city. And you enter the city and you buy a ticket. The ticket is valid for 24 hours. You can exit and enter as many times as you want. Outside the city of Khiva, there are hotels, there are restaurants, there are places. So we were in and out of that. Our hotel was not too far away from there. We were in and out of Khiva about 4 times in that 24 hours. We went out to have lunch, then we came back, then we went out to have dinner, then we came back. The city is preserved in the way it was when it was built. It's only mud walls and the glazed tiles which are typical of Central Asia. And the city life goes on as it does. There are a few residences which have been converted into homestays. You go there and your luggage will be taken at the gate and placed on mules. And inside the city there are only mules that are permitted to travel. No motorized transport. Because motorized transport is going to destroy the mud-packed streets. And you have to see the number of tourists that go to Khiva. That entire district will not be earning as much foreign currency as that one city does. We do not realize, or we are blind to it. There is no city like Delhi. I am not saying it because I am a Delhi wala. There is no city like Delhi in the world. One place which was a capital of a country of this dimension for close to 1,000 years. So many dynasties, so many empires, so many building styles, all of the ruins of all that in one place. What a phenomenal it's actually an archaeology museum. If you look at its buildings, the evolution of the dome, the evolution of the arch, the minaret, all of this, and how changing building material transforms the shape of architecture. There is all that is there in Delhi. And there is the Delhi food. There are very few places in the world that can beat the phenomenal variety of Delhi food. We have unfortunately reduced it to tandoori chicken and butter chicken and bedmi puri. There is Gujarati food in Delhi, traditional मारवाड़ी फूड, दिल्ली बनियों का फूड, दिल्ली के कश्मीरियों का फूड, दिल्ली के माथुरों का फूड. The range is unlimited. We are not even scraping the surface in terms of what all can you do if Delhi was to become a heritage city. And just throw out the wholesale traders. Let this city become a city where not more than 3 lakh people will live. And let the Havelis come back into their original shape. And then you can convert them into libraries, into music academies, into homestays, into museums, into craft display centers, into training. Endless possibility. Ban all traffic. Rickshaws, pedal rickshaws, or you walk. Whole lot of fat Delhi people will lose the city will become much fitter. But there is no clash between development and heritage protection. It is those people who have no stake in this country's heritage who pose this question. Development goals have to be tailored to protecting your heritage. If we don't have our heritage, what are we living for? Our music, our attire, our range of food, our linguistic richness, all that is heritage, not only the structures. And if these things are obstructing development, then sorry, I don't want development. I am very happy in my backwardness.
I think with this we come. Okay, yeah, sure. Unmute yourself and ask the question. Sure, Anna.
Good evening, sir. So it has
Good
been
evening.
great experience hearing you. Actually, my question is not related to the topic, but I wanted to ask your opinion regarding. I was reading a book. It is by Graham Hancock, and he gives a very different view of the world history and how the dominant mainstream history perceives it. And he stretches, for example, the history of South America and the Inca Empire to way 1,000 years back. What do you think about how we are being told the histories from the dominant perspective? So, do you think that there should be a way in which we should be study that we get to know other these different kinds of perspectives? Because in our schools and even in the college we were not told about such things. So
No, certainly. You see, I think I alluded to that. If you approach the discipline of history scientifically, then you will not say that this information about our past is cast in stone. Our present knowledge, and if you listen to historians, they very rarely say this is what happened. They say perhaps, probably, because you do not know. There might be tomorrow something new might come out, and you would discover that all your earlier understanding has to be recalibrated. For example, till Mr. Christopher Columbus set out on his journey to discover India, and he landed up in the Bahamas, he convinced himself that he had reached India. It took them a while to discover, no, this is the wrong place, and they discovered the Incas and the Mayans and the descendants of those great civilizations which we had no idea about. Till the late 15th century, we had absolutely no idea of the existence of these two continents. Nobody knew. That obviously cast a totally new image of the world. There was, one of our spices is adrak, ginger. It's not native to India. But it arrived in India about a couple of hundred years before the birth of Christ, by a set of people who were shipping who were great travelers by the ocean in the Pacific. And they carried these things, galangal and ginger and yams, all of them from Pacific islands, and they distributed them all over wherever they went. And they took banana from India and they carried it to other places. Now, we did not know about these seafaring people till 3 or 4 decades ago. Now these seafaring people and their contribution to the spread of what we eat, fruit and vegetable that the world consumes today, is phenomenal. But till about 50 years ago or so, we had no idea who they were and how these things. Now that casts a new image of history and human evolution. So what we know today is based on our knowledge today. In my childhood, I would never have imagined that the Indus Valley civilization, or what we now know as the Harappan civilization, was spread next door. It was there in Farmana, in Haryana. The mature Harappan civilization had spread all the way to Haryana, Rakhigadi. I've been to those sites in my school and even in my college days. When I was in college, that is the time when the discoveries were first being made. And Professor Suraj Bhan, who taught archaeology at Rohtak University, he discovered all these sites. All of these sites are his discovery. And he made them in his 70s, early 70s. We didn't know anything about it. Now that casts a totally different picture. And the latest discovery that have come of the Indus Valley seals being found in the Crescent Valley in Iraq and in that area. So the maritime trade between Indus Valley and the people of Sumer. So there are constantly new discoveries being made, and many of them will make us rewrite our concepts of history. If you approach history with a scientific outlook, you will welcome the news.